great to see you.
Okay, Lois.
Haven't seen you since the teaching course. How things been going?
Oh, this year, the past few months have had its moments.
Really? I have this thing to do now, but why don't we go out tonight?
I don't know. I don't really have much energy lately. I just think I'll probably go to bed early.
Come on, we had a great time in New York. We went to karaoke. Let's go out. Has something happened?
Oh, it's silly. I had this patient complaint last week. I had to, actually call and apologize to the family.
Yeah, and that happened to me too. People just don't understand what we juggle. I just tried to let it roll off.
I know, it's just different this time.
Why?
Well, the day I had my shift that I got the complaint, I had to go to work, and it was the day after I had just had a miscarriage. And they made me work anyway. It's like they don't understand, Sometimes I feel like, I don't even want to do this anymore, but the paycheck and the insurance, there's really no choice.
Well, a lot of women have miscarriages. It happens.
That's true, I know, but it was my third in a year. It's really got me down. I just feel like, nobody's understanding. Maybe God doesn't want me to have another baby. My husband really wants another baby. I don't know. I just feel like there's no hope.
Wow. Right? Have you guys heard things like this before? There's no hope for me. What do I do? So my name is Christopher Doty.
I'm Lois Swisher.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about responding to high-risk situations and risk in really ourselves, our colleagues, and our learners. And I think we do want to take the emphasis off just the learners because we spend a lot of time with each other, and we need to be ready for the staff and the faculty and whoever else. All right, let me. So, in way of disclosures, I have none. There's not a lot of money in wellness yet. So no drug company, no device company disclosures for myself. I am a member of the board of directors of CORD, which probably most of you know. So these are learning objectives. We're gonna spend just a second talking about this. You guys can read a lot faster than I can. But basically, how do you pick up on these risky behaviors? This conversation, is that out of the ordinary? When do we pull the trigger? When do we do something about it? When do we say, wait a minute, there's something more to that. We're going to try to talk about barriers to these risky behaviors, language situations, what should cue you into what some more stuff that's going on, and talk about these barriers, and then the way to try to use something called got a mental blank, nonviolent communication strategies to help with this. So, is there a problem? Do we really need to address this? And I would argue, yes, we do. There is a huge problem. And if you have been paying attention to any of the national organizations, you're seeing that there is something here going on. This is a slide that I stole from Dara Cass. Well, she and I did a presentation, and she put it in the combined presentation, and I took it right out of that and put it into this when it was time to get this talk together, because it's compelling. Up to 10% of fourth-year students and interns consider suicide. You are at a 2-time higher risk than the general population. And then 400 doctors a year commit suicide. At the University of Kentucky, that is almost 3 full classes. 3 full medical school classes just to take care of the attrition due to suicide. every year. And this probably is underreported. Physicians are pretty good at the lethality and also would know how to hide it. Over 60% of our residents report burnout. When you look at the Medscape, in our plenary session today, we looked at the Medscape numbers. Emergency medicine is 52% of practicing physicians in the 2017 survey. We are the second highest group in that study. It's another study came out 2014 that had us number one. But the range is narrow. It runs from 53% to in the high 30s, 38% for the lowest, which is dermatology. So here we go. Sorry, I'm talking from my slides here, but we see 53% is acute care medicine. We are at 52, and then in the high 30s for dermatology. So very narrow spectrum. So how do we reach this Zen moment? How do we get better at this? How do we find some way to live and be happy and survive this? So this is the wellness wheel that I like to look at. There are hundreds of these things on the internet, and these are the 8 domains that I think about. You can find some with 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. I saw one with 12. But I want to run you through a time in my life. So here I am, devastatingly handsome, young, 2006 maybe. I was had the world by the tail. I was absolutely in line for a job that I had been working at for my entire professional career. I trained at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, County Strong. And I was going to become the program director. And I had been married for about 6 and a half years. And my wife and I were just really not getting along. And when you don't get along with your wife, it begins to take little chunks. So the first was that there was no intimacy in the relationship, both physical and emotional. But we had become roommates rather than married partners. I got depressed about that. I wasn't happy. I had never really failed at much in my entire life. And I was watching this marriage become more and more unstable. I was watching my life unravel. And pissed me off, right? I was failing at something. We got divorced. And living in New York City, now paying for my apartment and her apartment, because she made about $20,000 a year, which in New York City is well below the poverty line, and splitting up the assets. I took a huge hit to my financial wellness. And invariably, you go to divorce. And you don't just split up the china. You split up people. And she's much more likable than I am. So this split is not even fair. She got the friends. I got the cat, which I didn't want. Damn cat. So I was in a bad state, and you can see people, and there are people in this room that lived with me at work during this time, and they saw me come apart. They watched it happen. And I didn't talk to anybody about this.
How many people you tell?
Let's see. So at the time, 0.
Yeah.
None.
There's barrier number 1. Some people won't talk. And it's estimated, give or take, about a third of people won't give any signs that they're suicidal. And those that are most at risk or have the severest depression are the ones that are going to avoid help. So it's really hard to sometimes identify these people. So did you want to talk?
Yeah. This can go off? Yeah. So yes, I did. Yes and no. I wanted people to care. I wanted people to try to reach out, but under no circumstances was I going to discuss my depression with people, even though I knew and they knew that it was obvious. But yeah, I wanted people to ask. I just didn't want to talk about it.
Barrier number 2. How do you ask? Because you have the sense maybe somebody wants to say something, but is it too personal? And what if they say something that's awful and you think you might have to like send them to a crisis or they could lose their license? And it's like, but I really wanted to ask Chris? I don't think so. I don't think that at that point it would have felt really risky. Right. So we're ER doctors. So let's go to something we're way more comfortable with, and that's anaphylaxis. We know anaphylaxis. We know it's a life-threatening medical condition. We know it happens in a severe allergy. We know what we're looking for. And when we see it, we know what to do. We give epi. And we know that the bystander that's trained can save a life. So now let's switch out anaphylaxis and go to suicide. How do we feel about that? Well, we know it can be a life-threatening psychological emergency. And what it really is, what we know is that it is pain exceeding coping. And we as ER doctors know exactly what to do. We medically clear them and we send them to psych. Except when it's your colleague. We don't talk about what you're going to do. And we saw the numbers, 10% of our trainees. What do you do for them? Barrier number 3, fear. And I like these too. Forget everything and run. And I think that's what we oftentimes do. Or 2, face everything and rise. And that's what we're going to challenge you today. When you hear this, and it is terrifying, what are you going to do? How are you going to face this and rise? So this is back to Chris's wellness wheel. And it looks a little scary. But Dara, at the beginning of March, came up with this brilliant analogy to anaphylaxis. It is, because we know what to do in anaphylaxis. And Dara was a resident with Chris and lived through that time. And it's like, how do you know when to ask? When should you make that jump? And we know when to make that jump with anaphylaxis. When 2 systems are involved, that's when we give epi. So as sort of a way to give courage to people of when they should ask, when you see that 2 systems are being hit, that's the time to ask. That's the time that you want to get the EpiPen. You want to say, how are you doing? Are you okay? And rise to that.
So, several of you have heard this story. I was talking with a longtime colleague this morning, who's facing a resident that they feel might be at risk. And they said, it's terrifying. It's terrifying to think about this and to face this. And yeah, it is. So this is Carlos. Many of you have heard parts of this story. Some of you may have heard more of it. But the purpose of the story is to engage you as an educator on a visceral level, to terrify you, because it is terrifying. Carlos, second-year resident at my institution. He was a UK student. I knew him from the time that he became interested in emergency medicine, moved up through the College of Medicine. He matriculated in the residency. I was excited that he came. Carlos was smart and funny and humble, and had fantastic empathy for our patients. He grew up in a non-privileged environment, and he saw our patients as his people, and really was tremendously invested. And I value that. I value people that are tremendously invested in our patients. And Carlos's mother got sick. He became dysfunctional. There's a long story beside that, but from a program director standpoint, because we're either program directors or educators, I did what a program director should do. Pulled Carlos off clinical service, sat him down in my office, pulled out my dusty binder, pulled out the resources. Actually, I had just 2 weeks before sent out all the resources to all the residents of my program because it was around Christmas time. Christmas time's a tough time. I've been a program director for over a decade at this point when this happened, and seen this ebb and flow. It's January, February. It's a tough time. He's a second-year resident. That's a tough time. It's Christmas, tough time. He's going through some challenges. So have sent the resources to all the residents, pulled Carlos into my office, met with him probably 10, 15 times, and did everything I was supposed to do. Put him on a research elective. Sorry, I didn't put this on silent. I apologize. That was R2D2. Yeah. That's my wife. Exactly. So, I did all the stuff I thought I should do. Well, Carlos, in an acute grief reaction when he realized his mother was never going to see daylight again, went home and took his own life. The effect on the program, the effect on me, the effect on my faculty, on his co-residents was absolutely devastating. And I had no idea what to do. I felt like I gave this imagery this morning. I felt like this sort of kicker who's on the football field and like looking this way, and some 260-pound linebacker just clocks the guy from this way. I mean, I had no idea this was coming, but I should have. I was experienced program director. This kid was in front of me 15 times. Missed it. I missed it. I didn't reach out enough because I didn't want to invade his personal space. I didn't want to remove the last bit of control he may have had he sees control melting all around him. I missed it. So if you don't think this can happen to you, then you're not thinking about this hard enough. And there, before the grace of God, go any of us. I was suddenly aware of my complete incompetence. Now, I know I can be a better husband. I certainly know I can be a better father. I can be a better educator. And I'm always looking for ways to improve as a clinician. But the program director role, I got this down pat. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've trained 400 residents. I got the easy button on this. But no, my residents know more about this ECMO circuit. My residents know more about this ECMO circuit, than they do about, physician wellness as of January 7th, the day before this happened. So this is me on January 7th, right? I have some medical issues. I do occasionally get sort of seasonal affective disorder, like my dad. I am very serious, right? I moved from my very close friends in New York City to Kentucky, and I still haven't really set up a great friend base there outside of medicine. I mean, I've got some great people that I work with, but I don't have a lot of non-medical friendships. So this is a fair assessment of where we are. My financial wellness is good. I feel like I'm reading, and I feel like I'm living within my value system. I feel like I interact with my environment. So the other pieces I feel okay with. Immediately, I go to here. I get a little more depressed, right? But I immediately feel like what the hell have I been doing for 15 years? How could this happen to me? How could I be so incompetent, so stupid in somebody who has valued this role, this job, and strived to master my craft? I really have strived to master my craft as a physician and as an educator for my entire career. How could I have let this happen?
Chris and I have talked a lot in the last year. I missed it. That one's been the one that's been really hard for me. We've had some other hard ones. I've had a chance, which I have continued to say that may not be true, may have had an opportunity, but I'm not sure if you really have a chance, because you have to know what you're looking at. And if you don't know what you're looking at, how can you make a difference? And we got that letter last year, January 11th, and I started reading it, and I got to the end of the first paragraph, and it read that one of Chris's residents died because of a sick family member, killed himself. And I immediately thought I knew that story because it could have been mine. And as I read down in that letter, it said, I missed it. And I thought I knew how. Because we don't train people how to recognize those suicide warning signs. And people are evasive and indirect. And then I thought, there's a lot of pain in that letter. And how can we change that? And maybe the way I could help is, having been a person on that journey, share what it was like for me. So in the interest of time, this is going to be really fast. In December 1999, my husband and I took our then 5-year-old daughter to CHOP for a reassurance MRI. And as we were sitting in the MRI suite, the neuroradiologist came in and said, yes, Mom, it's a posterior fossa tumor. And the walls started to collapse in, and I couldn't breathe, and I ran out of the room. And as I ran out of the room, I turned around, and that's what I saw. How can anyone be a good mom and have that in their kid's head? Were they around? Were they paying attention? How could you be a good doctor and not know that orange is in a kid's head? And I was totally inconsolable, because if that's okay, how can I ever work in the emergency room again and discharge people when I didn't know that was happening? So they took us out of the MRI suite and whisked us up to the PICU, and she went to surgery. And she came back to me, blind, mute, paralyzed, incontinent, severely hypotonic, could not do any voluntary motions at all. But she could hear and think like a normal 5-year-old. And on that day, my dream child died. You know that dream child, the one that can go to Harvard, can be president, could cure cancer? The daughter that I knew was no more. In 48 hours, my daughter had a brain tumor. It was cancer, and she was totally disabled. And I had no idea how to do that. I didn't even know anybody who ever did that. And my family was looking at me. I'm the doctor. I'm supposed to know clinical trials and chemotherapy and radiation, and I didn't know what to do. And I had to figure this out. This is my wellness wheel after that. It was like a bomb went off. Every single part of my life was affected. Before she got out of the hospital, I was already back to my hospital, and it was like coming home. I was in control. I was competent. I controlled the morphine. It was great. And I felt like I could shut out my real world. And as I shut out my real world, this is how I looked at work. And people didn't know quite what to do. They're like, hey, you look like you're handling this well. Your daughter's so lucky to have you because, you've been strong. And every once in a while, somebody would ask, how you doing? They would peek behind that stethoscope, and my real life would start leaking out. And I would say, I don't know how to do this. I don't know if there's any hope. If there was a merciful God, I wouldn't be here, but I guess there's not, so I am. I work at a Catholic institution. And then I came upon there's nothing that 100 units of insulin wouldn't cure. And people didn't know what to do with that. Nobody ever asked. But I found a way to cope. And it was great. And I loved it. And it was before Pyxis, so I could open the refrigerator, and I could take out the insulin, and I could go to the sink, and I could think about this, and I could rehearse. And I knew I had a choice. Everything else was out of control, but I could do this. And I loved thinking about it. So how do you know who's at risk? We've heard 4 stories. All of them could be at risk. And here's the bad news. You don't know. You don't know which of the people out there are going to kill themselves. Experts don't know. Don't expect the psychiatrist to be able to tell which one is going to die. But the good news is that most people who are thinking about it aren't going to kill themselves. They're just really looking for a way out of pain. And it doesn't really matter because you can have the people at crisis at a time of crisis, but if they're upstream and depressed, you can do the same thing and it helps. So, how are we going to know who is at risk? I think what we have to do is address everyone the same, to ask those questions and to connect with them.
So this is an image that I stole from Lois. Well, I stole the image from the internet, but this is a Plimsoll line. And what a Plimsoll line is, Samuel Plimsoll was a social reformer in England. And what he noticed is that merchants in England were over-insuring their ships and then overloading the ships and sending them to the New World, to America. So if the ship went down, they got paid. If the ship didn't go down, they got a bunch of cargo over there. The problem with overloading the ships is they're more likely to go down. So Plimsoll came up with this visual way of looking at a ship and marking what's the safe load. So we see here that this is the Plimsoll line. And, if you guys ever quit medicine and go into the merchant marine, you look at a cargo ship. If you can't see this line, don't get on the boat. Right? It's overloaded. We've refined this somewhat, and if you look at large container ships, you'll see this. But it changes. The Plimsoll line, the safe load, changes with the environment you're in. So if you're sailing around tropical fresh water, you can load that boat more. It'll sink deeper into the water, but you're safer. If you're in the harsh conditions of the winter North Atlantic, you need more freeboard. You need more space above the waterline. So our Plimsoll line, our safe load, changes dramatically with the environment we're in. I always consider myself a sort of tough person, right? I can put up with a lot of stuff. But in the environment of going through a divorce, the environment of having a sick parent, the environment of having, things, financial, stressors, that changes your resiliency.
So we wanted to give you a couple of different ways to think about suicide and suicidal ideation. We talked about the wellness wheel. We talk about the Plimsoll line. I'm going to give you two theories within the suicide community. And one is Joyner's theory of suicide. And if you look at that and think about our trainees and how many of them are at risk, there's three factors. One is on capability, the acquired capability for suicide. We teach them all about talks, about trauma. They all know how to kill themselves. On the other side is the desire for suicide. And you need two factors. Thwarted belongingness, that really is a sense of isolation. And if you think about leaving medical school, coming to residency, changing rotations every 3-4 weeks, we make these residents isolated. And then there's perceived burdensomeness. That's just a sense of failure, not living up to what the expectations are. And that's a lot of residency. So really, all our residents have the components to possibly be at risk for suicide. All they need is a situation that puts them over the edge. And there you are. This is another way to think about suicidal ideation. And it is moving from ideation to action. And there's really three things. It might be easier than asking, like, are you at risk? The two first factors are you in pain and are you hopeless? Hope is a huge protective factor. You can be really depressed, and if you have hope, you're probably not going to die by suicide. And if you have pain and hopelessness, the next thing you have to know is about connection. If that person's withdrawing and isolating, they are at really high risk. So those three things really make a difference in evaluating people.
So these are the things that we do have some weird changes in formatting. No, it's probably a font issue. What's that? Yeah, it's probably a font issue. But anyway, these are the things that are associated with resiliency. There are a few papers that look at this, but things you can do. You can address the stress in your life, right? We have stress. Don't deny it, right? We have a tough job. But addressing that stress, managing your emotions, knowing that you feel depressed this day, knowing that you feel inadequate because that case did not go the way you wanted to, right? Being cognizant of the environment that you're in. Are you in winter North Atlantic? Right? Are there a lot of things going on in your life? Maybe you cut yourself some slack. You can practice positivity, 3 great things, and Epter talked about that this morning. Every night, I think, what are the 3 great things that happened today? Often, with me, it has to do with my family. Right? That's almost always one of them. I have a 3-year-old. Every day is something new, right, that I can smile about or chuckle. But I find myself the next day looking for things like, what am I going to talk about tonight? Because the quicker I think of these 3 things, the quicker I can go to bed, which is like one of the great drivers of my life at this. So what are the three things? So I find myself looking for positive things to happen. Deepen the connectivity, this isolation. I think people die of isolation, right? People die of isolation. Carlos died of isolation, surrounded by people that loved him. And that's crazy. So deepen the connectivity, the density and the depth of relationships of the people around you. Reframe your thinking. When you see a sexual abuse or a physical abuse in your pediatric ED, right, you can either let that eat your soul, that we live in a world where that happens, or you can think about, wow, what a wonderful impact I get to have today, that I can identify and rescue a child at risk, and maybe that's child's siblings, or, this person came in and they were very ill and I helped save their life. Or I wasn't able to help save this person's life, but I was able to help this wife of 32 years or this wife of 58 years get through this. I make an impact. As Mel Herbert would say, what you do matters. Now I guess it's Rob Orman that says it, but you get the idea. It's absolutely true. We have such an impact. And then clarify your purpose. You didn't go into medicine to make money. You're going to have a comfortable life. But what we do is a passion. It is a vocation. It is a calling, like going into ministry.
So what we want to leave you with, one of the messages, is if you see something, say something. It can make a difference. However, too often I think it feels like this. You wonder if you're talking to death. And it's really not that. That's what I want to say, that it's a person in pain. They just are trying to find a way out of pain. So what you're really having is a chat with a person and trying to decrease their pain and increase their coping. That's not what's happening. And one of the ways to do that, two of the ways to do this is to let a person talk and just listen to them, connect with them so they don't feel isolated. People have asked me when I was standing at the sink, what made a difference for me? And really it was thinking about that connectivity. It was the people who really liked charcoal, took whatever crazy, wild, cruel thoughts that were in my mind and let it be okay. And when I started talking about this, it was terrifying. Like the thought of doing this would put me in a puddle without a question. And once I started talking, those suffocating feelings, those thoughts disappeared. And it made a difference. And you think it's hard, but it's not. Remember medical school? We all had good doctor-patient communication. It's the same thing. Eye contact, encouraging body language, open-ended questions, touch, and giving a person time. And sometimes that's all that you need.
One of the things that I will regret for the rest of my life is not how I managed the program aspects, the administrative aspects of Carlos's depression, not a suicide. With the suicide, I did the best I possibly could. I mean, there's no playbook, right? You're building the plane as you fly it when something like that happens. But his depression, I managed well from a program director standpoint. What I didn't do and what I will regret for the rest of my life is not just wrapping Carlos in a hug. So not interfacing with him as his employer or as his educator or as his program director, but just interfacing with him as a human being and just wrapping him in a hug and say, Carlos, man, I'm sorry. I cannot imagine losing my parents. And I know one day it'll happen. But the pain of that has to be overwhelming. And I will be here with you one day at a time, 1 minute at a time if that's what it takes. But we'll be here together. And I didn't do that. I think my residents know that I care about them, but that's different than just wrapping them up in a hug. Vaccines save lives. I don't believe Jenny McCarthy. Right? In today's society, I believe almost anything is possible. Maybe they cause autism. I don't know. But what they don't cause is polio. So I believe they save lives. And I think there are some vaccinations. I think these are the vaccinations. There's some science behind this, but not a ton. Adequate sleep. My resiliency is tied to sleep. My ability to be a good dad is tied to sleep. I see myself being an ass to my 3-year-old toddler son, and I can't stop it. Right? I get mad at him when he makes a mess because I didn't get enough sleep the night before. And I know that if I don't get sleep, that I'm not going to be as good a father. Because it's his job to make a mess. He's 3. Like his job description, make a mess. Right? Throw food. So if I don't get enough sleep, it affects that. Adequate downtime, mental, physical downtime, important. Exercise is absolutely a vaccination against stress. Social connectedness, you've heard me talk about this a couple of times. The density and depth of connectivity with the people around us, both medical and non-medical, critically important. People die of isolation. Understand the impact that you have. Whoops, sorry. You see, we're almost done. Understand the impact that you have, right? Reframe your thinking around the things that happen in that emergency department. For you, it's a Tuesday. For them, it's the worst day of their life. And you get to help them. What marvelous impact we get to have in our life. And then clarify the purpose. What are you doing this for? Is this a calling for you? Probably is, right? Even people that I know that just punch the clock. It's still a calling. Nobody does this job for the money, right? They do it because they believe that they're affecting the world. So thank you very much. I appreciate you listening. We've gone right to time. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer that. And I would say, acknowledgement-wise, that I have worked with several people on several iterations of these resilience talks, and I have stolen like an artist. So themes were borrowed from everyone that I've worked with, and every time I find a different way of explaining it, I steal it. So acknowledgments to a bunch of people that I've worked on these things with.